This is a camera lens, and this is a camera lens, and this is a camera lens. All of them are different, all of them have a different look, and all of them serve a different purpose. There's a lot to talk about with camera lenses. When you go into a camera store or when you go online, you're bombarded with so many lens options, and honestly, it's a little bit confusing when you're just starting out. In this video, I'm gonna give you guys a good understanding of camera lenses, what all the lingo and numbers mean, and by the end of this video, you'll have all the information that you need to go and buy your first or maybe your second or your third camera lens. I'm going to assume going into this that you have a basic understanding of cameras and what terms like crop sensor, full frame, DSLR, and mirrorless means. If you don't, go back and watch my beginner's guide to buying a camera where I go through all of this, and then come back to this video. All right, let's start with the basics. There are two types of camera lenses, prime lenses and zoom lenses. Prime lenses, like this one, are fixed at a certain focal length. This one here is a fixed 85mm lens, 85mm being the focal length. Think about the focal length as the amount of range that the lens has. The bigger the number, the further away that the lens is able to see. When you look at a lens, both on the physical lens, on the box, and on the listing online, it will have the focal length listed on it. So that's a prime lens. The focal length is fixed. So if you wanted to get a closer shot, you would physically need to move closer to the object that you're shooting since the lens itself doesn't zoom. A zoom lens, on the other hand, is able to zoom in and out, and so it doesn't have a focal length, it has a focal range. This is a 100mm to 400mm zoom lens, meaning that you can shoot photos at any focal length within that range by just turning the zoom ring on the lens. Again, you'll know that a lens is a zoom lens because on the lens itself and online, it will list a range like 24 to 70 or 17 to 28 instead of just a fixed number. Before we move past focal length, you should have a basic understanding of what some common focal lengths are and what they're used for. They say that 50mm is more or less the way that your eyes see the world. And this is such a common lens that it even has a special name, the Nifty 50. It's a really versatile lens and you can take it pretty much anywhere to shoot basically anything with, which is why it's such a popular lens. Anything less than 50mm is considered a wide-angle lens. One example of a common lens is a 35mm lens, which is typically used to shoot portraits, landscapes, and street photography. When you start going down even further than this, like 24mm or even wider than this, you start getting into the ultra wide angle lenses. These ultra wide angle lenses are used commonly in things like real estate photography, where you really want to capture the entire space. They're also used a lot in things like landscape photography, where you want to capture the entire landscape in the frame. On the other side of 50mm, anything greater than this is considered a telephoto lens. An 85mm lens, one of my favorite lenses, is a common telephoto lens used for street photography, for portraits, as is a 135mm lens. This is a 100 to 400mm lens, which is perfect for shooting things like wildlife or landscapes where you really want to punch in on the subject. Sports is another common application where you would use a telephoto lens, as you usually can't be right up close to the action. A common kit of lenses that a lot of photographers either own or are working towards owning is something called the Holy Trinity. It's a kit of 3 lenses that pretty much covers your basis for anything that you'd regularly shoot, unless you're shooting something really specific. It's a 16 to 35mm, a 24 to 70, and a 70 to 200. Now, 16 to 200 is a huge focal range, and it pretty much covers anything that you would regularly shoot. Now, each manufacturer will make a slightly different version of each of these. It may not be a 16 to 35, it may be a 17 to 35, or in the case of Tamron, 17 to 28. But the point is that it's a wide-angle zoom lens. Then the Holy Grail, 24 to 70. This right here is your standard carry around with you everyday type lens, and it's literally the lens that lives on my camera 90% of the time. And the 70 to 200 telephoto. I opted for the 100 to 400 as I wanted more range, but that's really just a personal preference. The point is that it's a zoom telephoto. I think this right here is a really good kit to start building out. You may decide to go with something else later, and that's fine. That's the point of experimenting with different lenses and different focal lengths, but without knowing what you really like to shoot, and as a beginner, I think this is a really solid set of lenses. You may have noticed that in addition to having the focal range or the focal length printed on the lens, there's another number next to it. f2.8, f1.8, f1.4. What do these numbers mean? Every lens has what are called aperture blades inside it, which open and close to let light in. How a lens is rated is based on the widest aperture the lens is capable of. The lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture can open. The wider the aperture, the more light that the lens can let in. Because light is so important in photography, lenses that are able to open up wider are also more expensive. So an f1.4 lens is going to be more expensive than an f1.8 lens, all other things being equal. The price difference is not insignificant either. For example, check out the price of the Sony 70-200 f4 lens versus the 70-200 f2.8 lens. It's crazy. Because the 70-200 f2.8 lens can let in more light than the f4 lens, we also call it a faster lens. This is because if you can open up the lens wider to let more light in, then you can increase the shutter speed and keep the same exposure. This is really handy for things like shooting sports where you really need a high shutter speed to freeze the motion. This is getting into a fundamental concept of photography known as the exposure triangle, which I'm not going to get into in this video, but if you don't already know what that is, you should definitely look it up and understand it. You'll notice some lenses, just like with focal lengths, have a range of apertures and some have a single number. If the lens has a range of apertures, it's known as a variable aperture lens. These are typically cheaper, lower quality lenses like the ones you'll see that come with cameras. Those are also called kit lenses. Lenses that have a constant aperture, like this 24-70 f2.8 lens, are known as a constant aperture lens. They're usually bigger, more expensive, and usually higher quality, just because it takes more glass components to have a constant aperture lens throughout an entire focal range. There is an exception to the constant aperture versus variable aperture when it comes to quality, and that is when it comes to the telephoto lenses. When you get into lenses over 200 millimeters, like this 100 to 400 millimeter lens, the super telephoto type lenses, they're pretty much all going to be variable aperture lenses. You can find some super telephoto lenses with a constant aperture, but they're insanely expensive and they're huge. The holy trinity of lenses that I referred to earlier usually come in both an f4 version and an f2.8 version. The f2.8 versions are going to be significantly more expensive, but they're going to be better in low light, better quality. Also, if you're looking for that blurry background in your photos, the wider your aperture or the lower the f-stop of the lens, the blurrier that background is going to be, which is what a lot of people want, especially in portraits. Two more things on aperture. First, some lenses will have a ring on them where you can physically control the aperture on the lens, and others you just control the aperture electronically through the camera. The aperture ring is mainly used for people shooting video who want the ability to change the aperture throughout a shot. For photography, it doesn't really matter. And the ones that do let you change it on the lens usually let you change it on the camera as well. Second, cinema lenses are a bit different. Rather than having an f-stop, they have what's called a t-stop. Same idea though, the lower the t-stop, the more light the lens can let in. I talked about the difference between prime lenses and zoom lenses earlier, but now that we've touched on aperture, we can really compare the two. While zoom lenses are more versatile in the sense that you can zoom in and out within a focal range, prime lenses have an advantage when it comes to being able to let in more light. With a zoom lens like this 24-70 millimeter lens, the widest that you can get is an f2.8 lens. That's literally the widest they make. They don't make anything that opens wider than this. Whereas with a prime lens like this 85mm lens, this thing can open to f1.4, and they even make ones that open up to f1.2. This is why a lot of photographers like prime lenses for things like portraits, where you can get really shallow depths of field or get really blurry backgrounds in your photos. It's also a lot cheaper to get a faster lens if it's a prime lens. For example, you can pick up the nifty 50, a 50mm lens, at an f1.8 lens for pretty much any camera brand for like $250. But the cheapest 24-70mm f2.8 lens is still like $900. It just costs more to make a zoom lens that can open up really wide. This is why I think that the 50mm f1.8 lens is really the perfect first lens to get, especially if you're on a budget. It's cheap, it's fast, and the quality is actually quite good. It's also a lens that every manufacturer makes, so it's really easy to find both new and on the used market. This entire video, the focal ranges and the focal lengths that I've referred to are full frame lenses. If you have a crop sensor camera like this A6300, you can still get these same or similar type of lenses, but the focal ranges are just going to be different. And that's due to something called the crop factor. The crop factor is the ratio of your camera's sensor size to that of a full frame sensor. So for this a6300, the crop factor is 1.5. What this means is that on this Sony a6300, a 35mm lens would have the equivalent field of view of a 52mm full frame lens, which is why I would recommend picking up a 35mm f1.8 lens as your first lens if you have a crop sensor camera. It's basically the nifty 50, but for a crop sensor. To go the other way, a 24 to 70mm full frame lens is the equivalent of a 16 to 47mm lens. This is why you'll see different focal ranges for APS-C or crop sensor camera, like this 17 to 55 f2.8 lens. It's pretty much the equivalent to a 24 to 70mm f2.8, but it's for a crop sensor camera. Not exactly the same, but it's the middle lens in the holy trinity of lenses. It should be noted that aperture is also affected by the crop factor. Not only do you need to convert the focal length with the crop factor, but also the aperture. So the 35mm f1.8 lens I recommended a minute ago is actually the full frame equivalent to a 50mm f2.7 lens. This means that you actually can't get as shallow of a depth of field on a crop sensor camera as you can on a full frame camera. Take this 85mm f1.4 lens for example. To convert it to the crop equivalent, let's divide each number by the crop factor, in this case 1.5. You end up with a 57mm f0.9 lens. They just don't make this lens, so you actually just can't get the equivalent lens on a crop sensor camera. To make things worse for crop sensor cameras, if you buy a full frame sensor camera later, your crop lenses won't really work with them. This is one of the reasons why in my beginner's camera guide video, I recommend just skipping a crop sensor camera altogether and going with a full frame sensor camera right off the bat. I'm not going to spend too much time on this as most people nowadays have a mirrorless camera. But the lenses for mirrorless cameras and DSLR cameras are different. You can use an older DSLR lens on a mirrorless camera with an adapter, but not the other way around. Either way, I wouldn't recommend picking up a DSLR camera in 2024, and I talked about this in my beginner camera guide video. Speaking of adapters, one thing to be aware of is the fact that each camera system has its own mount. Sony cameras utilize the E mount, Canon's newer cameras the RF mount, Nikon's new mirrorless cameras the Z mount. When you go to buy a camera lens, you'll need to buy it for your specific camera's mount. Some mounts like the E mount have been opened up to third-party lens manufacturers like Sigma and Tamron. This means that you aren't restricted to buying just Sony lenses, but you can also buy third-party lenses like Sigma and Tamron. The Canon RF mount, however, has not been opened up to lens manufacturers like Sigma and Tamron, and so you're stuck with buying really expensive Canon lenses. This is actually something really important to consider when you're thinking of buying a camera, and it's something that I went over in my beginner's camera guide. Because Sony's mount is open, I was able to buy Sigma and Tamron versions of the Holy Trinity lenses, and rather than spending $10,000 on Sony lenses, I was able to get mine for $3,500. Now, there are adapters that you can buy to convert from one mount to another. That being said, whenever you use a lens adapter like this, you always risk reducing the performance of the lens, either via the autofocus, the image quality, or other lens functionality, so that's just something to consider. If you can, it's typically best to use lenses that are specifically built for your camera mount. On the subject of autofocus, there are two types of camera lenses. Those that autofocus and those that don't, and that you have to manually focus. Most lenses these days fall into the first category and have really good autofocus. But some lenses, like this macro lens, you have to manually focus. This is the case with some cheaper lenses, some older lenses, and some more expensive lenses like cinema lenses, where you actually want to manually focus. If you're a beginner, just stick with newer camera lenses that can autofocus. The autofocus system in most lenses these days is fantastic. You can always switch the focus type to manual in your camera anyway, so you can manually focus pretty much any lens already. Some lenses will have a physical switch on the lens where you can switch from manual focus to autofocus. Other lenses, you'll have to do this in the camera. Some lenses have other buttons and functionality as well, such as optical stabilization, which stabilizes your images, which is handy if you're shooting handheld. My camera body itself has in-body stabilization, but some cameras don't. So if you have a camera that doesn't have in-body stabilization, then it would be good to have a lens that had stabilization. Aside from your typical primes and zoom lenses, there are some other special lenses, and I've already briefly mentioned a few of them in this video. Cinema lenses, as I briefly discussed earlier, fall into this category. Macro lenses are another one. Macro lenses allow you to get really close to a subject to take macro shots like this. You can't do this with a normal lens because of something called a minimum focus distance. This is the minimum distance you can be from an object for the lens to be able to focus on it, both with the autofocus or with just manual. With a normal lens, you just can't get close enough to an object while being in focus to take a macro shot. Another more technical way to describe a macro lens is using something called a magnification ratio. A macro lens is a lens with a magnification ratio of 1:1 or greater. There are other types of special lenses that are less commonly used, but lenses like a tilt shift lens, anamorphic lenses, fisheye lenses, probe lenses, all of these are really special lenses and they're used to get a really specific look to your images. Last thing I want to touch on with lenses are lens filters and thread sizes. Lens filters are these extra pieces of glass that you can put on your lens to get different effects. Now, these can be for a functional reason like an ND filter, which darkens your image. But then there's other lenses that are more stylistic in nature, like the one that I'm using right now, which is a mist filter. I actually made an entire video on lens filters, so if you want to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description below. But the one thing that I want to touch on is thread sizes. Every lens has a diameter, and you can find out what that diameter is by looking at the lens cap. Hot tip, if you're gonna buy lens filters, don't buy lens filters for each one of your lenses. Buy the biggest possible lens filter that you can buy, and then buy what are called step-up rings to step up your smaller diameter lenses to make them fit your bigger lens filters. All right guys, that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. If it was, and you want to keep seeing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on my next videos. I'll see you guys in the next one.